They called her baggage. They called her a stray. They said a woman without a husband, a family name, or a clean record on paper had no place in decent society. But Abigail Mercer had something far stronger than money, status, or approval. She had dignity. Left behind on the Kansas Trail, judged by townsfolk, and hunted by lies from a greedy land speculator, Abigail would have every reason to disappear. Instead, she stood tall. This is the story of a woman the West tried to erase, and how she forced it to remember her name.
The dust was red. It tasted like iron and old sweat. Kansas in the autumn of '78 didn't care about your dreams. It only cared about your grit. The sun was dropping fast now. It bled across the Smoky Hill River like an open wound. It was beautiful, I suppose. But beauty doesn't put salt pork in the skillet. I stood behind the last wagon. Not in it. Behind it. That told the story of my life in one glance. I was 32 years old, a widow, an orphan before that. In a wagon train headed for California, those things make you a ghost. People look right through you. Or worse, they look at you like a debt they didn't ask to carry. Amos Thatcher, the wagon master, stopped his horse. He didn't look at me, he looked at his boots. That is how you know a man is about to do something he is ashamed of. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. His voice was like dry husks. "Mr. Thatcher," I replied. I didn't move. I didn't fidget. When you've been left behind as many times as I have, you learn to stand still. You become a rock. Rocks don't break. "The axle on the Miller wagon is snapped," he said. "We're over-leveraged. The oxen are spent. 2 families from the back paid extra to move their trunks into the lead scouts. We have to lighten the load." I knew what was coming. I'd seen the whispers for 3 days. "I've cooked every meal," I said quietly. "I've mended every shirt. I've nursed the Henderson boy through the croup. That was our trade, my labor for my passage." Thatcher finally looked up. His eyes were cold, hard. "Labor is cheap, Abigail. Space is dear. You're a woman alone. You got no husband to pull an oar. No kin waiting in the West. You're baggage, ma'am. And we're shedding baggage." He reached into his pocket. He tossed a small pouch into the dirt at my feet. $1.40. That's your refund, minus the miles we already gave you. I wish you luck." The lead wagon creaked, the wheels groaned. Forward. I didn't scream, I didn't beg. I reached down and picked up the pouch. Then I stood tall. I looked Thatcher in the eye until he had to turn away. "Wait," I said. My voice didn't shake. He paused. "I want you to hear this, Mr. Thatcher," I said, loud enough for the men on the nearby wagons to hear. "You think you're being practical. You think you're just managing a ledger. But you are wrong. My lack of a husband does not diminish my worth as a human being. A soul isn't measured in transit coins. My dignity is not baggage you can simply discard on the trail because it no longer suits your profit. I am a person. I have a right to exist, even when I am of no use to you." Thatcher didn't answer. He just flicked his reins. "Hyah!" I watched them go. I watched the dust kick up behind them until the last canvas hood disappeared over the rise. Silence is a heavy thing on the prairie. It's not the absence of noise. It's the presence of everything that isn't there. No voices, no fire, no protection. I sat down by a cottonwood tree. I checked my kit. A knife, a change of clothes, a map, and $1.40. Night came on cold. I didn't have a tent. I didn't even have a blanket. I just had the dark. Then I heard it. Hooves. Not a wagon. Not a heavy ox. These were light. Fast. A lot of them. I didn't run. I stepped into the tall grass and went low. My heart was a hammer in my chest, but I kept my breathing thin. A group of riders appeared in the moonlight. 4 men. A herd of maybe 30 horses. They were moving steady. Moving west. Suddenly, a young colt broke from the line. It was spooked. It charged right toward the brush where I was hiding. The animal was wild-eyed, terrified. It was going to snap a leg in the dark or trample me. I didn't think. I stood up. "Easy," I whispered. I didn't yell. I made a low, rhythmic sound in the back of my throat. A hum. Easy, little brother. The ground is steady. I am steady. I reached out my hand. I didn't grab. I just offered. The colt skidded. It blew air out of its nose, hot and wet. It trembled, but it stopped. It leaned its head toward my palm. That's it, I said. You're not alone. Neither are you, it seems. The voice was deep. It came from the shadows. A man rode forward. He was tall in the saddle. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but I could see his eyes. They weren't like Thatcher's eyes. They didn't look through me. They looked at me. He looked at the colt. Then he looked at the pouch of coins in my hand. Then he looked at the empty trail behind me. He saw the whole story without me saying a word. "You lost, ma'am?" he asked. I pulled my shoulders back. I wiped the red dust from my face. "No," I said. "My wagon train decided I was an extra weight. They left me." The man shifted in his saddle. He looked at the horizon, then back at me. "John Sterling," he said. He didn't tip his hat. He just watched me. "And that's a long walk to nowhere, Mrs. Mercer," I said. "Abigail Jane Mercer." "Well, Abigail Jane Mercer," Sterling said. "It seems we both have a long night ahead." The fire was a small, orange defiance against the Kansas night. It didn't put out much heat, but it gave the world a center. Around it, the shadows of 4 men stretched long and thin, like ghosts trying to tether themselves to the earth. John Sterling sat on a crate. He was cleaning a piece of tack, his hands moving with the steady rhythm of a man who didn't like to be idle. I stood on the edge of the light. I kept my bundle close to my feet. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. In my experience, kindness from a stranger usually came with a high interest rate. One of the younger men, a lean, hungry-looking sort named Caleb, spat into the dust. He hadn't stopped looking at me since I stepped into the camp. It wasn't a look of want. It was a look of resentment. "We're looing horses, John," Caleb said. His voice was a sharp rasp. "Not running a halfway house for every stray that gets dumped by a wagon master. A woman on the trail is bad luck. A woman with no kin is worse. She's a drain on the rations." I felt the familiar sting. I'd heard it in the asylum. I'd heard it in the fort. The idea that a person without a name or a family was just a hole where resources disappeared. I opened my mouth to speak, but Sterling didn't look up from his work. He spoke first. "A person is only a drain if they don't have a hand to lend, Caleb," Sterling said. His voice was low, like the roll of distant thunder. "She's a widow," Caleb argued. "An orphan by the look of her gear. She's got nothing. Why we carrying her weight?" Sterling stopped his hands. He looked at Caleb, then he looked at me. The silence stretched. It was the kind of silence that makes you hear your own heartbeat. "Step into the light, Mrs. Mercer," Sterling said. I did. I kept my chin up. I didn't hide my calloused hands. "You said you cooked for that wagon train," Sterling stated. It wasn't a question. "I did," I said. 3 meals a day, sourdough, beans, salt pork, and whatever I could forage. I can stretch a sack of flour further than most men can throw it." "And you know horses?" "My father was a farrier. I spent 12 years holding the lead while he worked the iron. I know their moods. I know their ailments." Sterling nodded. He turned back to Caleb, but his words were meant for everyone. "Here's the deal, Mrs. Mercer. My cook quit on me in Dodge City. Said his sister was dying in Independence, and he lit out. We've been eating burnt beans and hardtack for 3 days. My men are sour because their bellies are empty." He stood up. He was a tall man, built like the timber of a sturdy barn. "I will pay you $3 for 4 days of work. You cook breakfast, you pack a cold lunch for the saddle, and you make a hot supper. You'll have a wagon to sleep in. My son Sam sleeps there, but there's a partition. When we reach my ranch in the Flint Hills, you'll have 1 week of room and board to find your next step. No one will harass you. No one will tell you where to go." It was a fair trade. More than fair. But Caleb wasn't done. He mumbled something about stray women and the law of the trail. Sterling turned on him then. He didn't reach for a gun. He didn't even raise his voice. But the air around him seemed to grow heavy. "Listen to me, Caleb. And the rest of you, listen good," Sterling said. He looked each man in the eye. "Respect isn't a privilege reserved for men with land or guns, Caleb. It's a natural right for every person drawing breath. This woman has a name. She has a history. Her lack of a husband or a father standing behind her doesn't make her a target for your scorn. It makes our duty to be decent even greater. On my trail and in my camp, you will speak to Mrs. Mercer with the reverence she is owed as a human being. If you can't manage that, you can draw your pay now and find your own way through the dark." Caleb looked at his boots. He didn't say another word. Sterling looked at me. "Do we have an agreement, Abigail?" "We do," I said. My voice was steady, but my heart was doing a strange dance. "Then get some sleep," he said. "The sun comes up early in Kansas, and the fire doesn't wait for anyone to be ready." He pointed toward a small, sturdy supply wagon hitched to 2 mules. I walked toward it, feeling the weight of the coins in my pocket, the $1.40 from Thatcher. It felt lighter now, like it wasn't the only thing keeping me anchored to the earth. I climbed into the back of the wagon. It smelled of canvas, dry grain, and something sweet, like apples. In the corner, huddled under a thick wool blanket, was a boy. Samuel. He didn't move. He didn't speak. His eyes were wide and dark, reflecting the moonlight filtering through the canvas. He looked at me the way a rabbit looks at a hawk. "I'm Abby," I whispered. He didn't answer. He just pulled the blanket higher. I lay down on a bed of hay and sacks. The wagon swayed slightly as the wind picked up. For the first time in 6 weeks, I wasn't wondering if I'd wake up in a ditch. I was a cook. I was a worker. I was a person. The morning came in a bruise of purple and gold. I was up before the sun. That was the rule of the kitchen. If the coffee isn't hot when the boots hit the dirt, the day is already lost. I found the coffee mill in a crate. I found a slab of bacon and a tin of lard. By the time Sterling stepped out of his bedroll, the smell of frying meat was drifting across the camp. I'd found some wild onions near the riverbank and chopped them into the grease. It wasn't much, but it smelled like home. John Sterling walked to the fire. He poured a cup of coffee. He took a sip, closed his eyes, and sighed. "Best thing I've smelled in a week," he said. "Salt and heat," I said. "It does wonders." The day was a long, rhythmic grind. The men rode the perimeter of the horse herd. Sterling led. Caleb and the masked brothers, 2 quiet boys who worked hard and said little, kept the stragglers in line. I drove the supply wagon. Sam sat beside me. He didn't speak a word. He just watched the horizon. He was 8 years old, but he carried the silence of a man who had seen the end of the world. I didn't push him. Silence is a cage, but sometimes it's the only place that feels safe. By the afternoon of the second day, the heat was a physical weight. The horses were restless. Dust kicked up in thick, choking clouds. Suddenly, the lead scout, a pinto colt with a white splash on its chest, started limping. It began to fall back. Its ears were pinned and its eyes were rolling. Sterling called a halt near a stand of scrub oak. He hopped off his horse and tried to get near the colt, but the animal was frantic. It kicked out, nearly catching Sterling in the ribs. "Easy, son," Sterling muttered. He tried to grab the lead, but the colt reared. "He's gone lame, John," Caleb shouted. "Probably a stone or a break. If it's a break, we can't take him. He'll just draw the wolves." I handed the reins of the wagon to Sam. I didn't ask. I just put them in his small hands. I hopped down and walked toward the horse. "Mrs. Mercer, stay back," Sterling warned. "He's skittish." "He's not skittish," I said. "He's in pain." I didn't walk straight at him. I walked in a curve. I kept my eyes on the ground. I made that low, humming sound again, the one my father used when a stallion was ready to bite. The colt snorted. He shifted his weight. I reached the edge of his space and stopped. I waited. I let him smell the salt on my skin. Slowly, I moved my hand up. I stroked his neck. His hide was hot and twitching. "That's it," I whispered. I'm just looking. I ran my hand down his front leg. He flinched, but he didn't kick. When I reached the hoof, I felt the heat. It was radiating like an oven. I picked up the foot. A jagged piece of flint was wedged deep into the frog of the hoof. The area was already swollen and oozing. "Hand me my kit from the wagon," I called out. To my surprise, it wasn't Sterling who brought it. It was Sam. He climbed down from the seat and scurried over, holding my small canvas bag. He stood a few feet away, watching with wide eyes. I took out a small curved blade and a bottle of carbolic acid. I worked quickly. I pried the stone loose. The colt let out a sharp whinny, but he didn't pull away. I cleaned the wound, packed it with a clean rag, and tied it off with a strip of leather. "He'll need to walk slow, but he'll keep the leg," I said. I stood up, wiping the sweat from my brow with my sleeve. Sam was still staring at the horse. He reached out a hand, then pulled it back. "He trusts you," Sam whispered. It was the first time I'd heard his voice. It was thin, like a reed in the wind. I knelt down so I was at the boy's eye level. Sterling was standing just behind us, watching. The other cowboys had gathered around, silent for once. "He trusts me because I didn't force him, Sam," I said. I made sure my voice was clear so everyone could hear. "You see, Sam, you cannot break a spirit to earn its loyalty. That's a mistake a lot of men make. They think strength is about bending something until it snaps. But true loyalty only grows in the soil of equality and patience. I didn't order this horse to heel, and I didn't beat him into standing still. I listened to his pain. I showed him that I was a partner, not a master. When you treat a living thing, whether it's a horse or a person, like they have a say in their own life, they'll give you back more than you ever could have taken by force." Sam looked at the horse. Then he looked at his father. Sterling didn't say anything, but he reached out and placed a hand on Sam's shoulder. It wasn't a heavy hand. It was just there. "Well," Sterling said, his voice a bit rougher than usual, "I reckon that horse owes you his life, Abigail. And I reckon I owe you a thank you." "The trade was for cooking," I said, standing up and brushing the dirt from my skirt. "Consider the horse a bonus." "We move in 10 minutes, Sterling shouted to the men. As I walked back to the wagon, I felt a small hand tug on my sleeve. It was Sam. "Can you teach me?" he asked. "Teach you what, Sam?" "How to listen," he said. I smiled. It was the first real smile I'd felt in years. It felt strange on my face, but good. "I can do that," I said. "But it's a quiet lesson. You have to be ready to hear things that aren't being said." We climbed back onto the wagon seat. The sun was high now, baking the earth, but the air didn't feel quite so heavy. As we rolled forward, I looked at the pinto colt. He was walking with a slight limp, but he was walking. He was still part of the herd. I looked at the men riding ahead. I looked at the boy beside me. I had been left on the trail with nothing but $1.40. I had been baggage. I had been a ghost. But as the wheels turned and the dust rose, I realized something. The trail doesn't just take things away. If you keep your eyes open and your heart steady, it gives you a chance to see who you really are. I wasn't just a widow. I wasn't just an orphan. I was a woman who knew how to listen. And in a world full of men screaming to be heard, that was the greatest power of all. The Flint Hills didn't roll. They breathed. It was a sea of tall grass, amber and gold, under a sky so wide it made you feel like a speck of dust. But it was a good kind of small. For the first time in my life, the vastness didn't feel like a place to get lost. It felt like a place to be found. We crested a final rise as the sun was dipping low. And there it was, the Sterling Ranch. It wasn't a palace, it was a statement. The house was built of native limestone, thick-walled and sturdy. It looked like it had grown right out of the earth itself. There were no fancy carvings, no painted shutters, just honest stone and heavy timber. It was a house built by a man who intended to stay. "We're home, Sam," John said. His voice was different here. It had a resonance to it, a quiet pride. Sam didn't say anything, but he sat up a little straighter on the wagon seat. He looked at the barn, a massive structure that could have housed 50 horses and still had room for the hay. He looked at the corrals where men were already moving, swinging gates with practiced ease. I pulled the team to a halt near the kitchen porch. My heart was thumping. This was the end of the 4 days, the end of the agreement. A woman stepped out onto the porch. She was older, her hair a shock of white pulled into a tight bun. She had a flour-dusted apron and eyes that looked like they'd seen every storm Kansas had to offer. This was Martha. "About time, John Sterling," she called out. Her voice was like a rusted hinge, sharp but reliable. "I've been cooking for 12 men with a back that feels like it's being gnawed on by a wolf." "Martha, this is Mrs. Mercer," John said, stepping off his horse. "She's the reason the men aren't starving, and she's the reason that Pinto Colt is still walking." Martha looked at me. She didn't smile. She just assessed. She looked at my hands. She looked at the way I held the reins. Then she nodded. "Kitchen's through there," she said, pointing a thumb over her shoulder. "Wash basin's on the left. Don't touch my cast iron until you've scrubbed." It was the warmest welcome I'd had in a decade. The next few days were a blur of wood smoke and grease. Martha's back was indeed in a bad way, sciatica, she called it. So I took over the heavy lifting. I hauled the water. I kneaded the bread. I kept Sam close, letting him help me shell peas or snap beans. He still didn't talk much, but he stayed. He didn't run. But the peace didn't last. It never does when there's money to be made. 3 days in, a black carriage rolled into the yard. It was shiny, out of place. A man stepped out wearing a suit that cost more than a good horse and a hat that had never seen a speck of trail dust. Hiram Thaddeus. He was a land speculator, a man who bought the future and sold it to the highest bidder. He wanted John's eastern acreage for the Union Pacific expansion. I was on the porch shaking out a rug when he approached. John was coming up from the barn. Hiram stopped and looked at me. He didn't see a woman, he saw a servant, or worse. He looked at my worn dress and my orphan quiet eyes. He curled his lip just a fraction. "Sterling," Hiram called out, ignoring me entirely. "I see you've added to the livestock. A new stray for the kitchen?" The air went still. The birds in the cottonwoods seemed to stop singing. John stepped onto the porch. He didn't rush. He moved with a slow, deliberate gravity. He stood right beside me. He didn't touch me, but I could feel the heat of his presence. He was a wall of limestone. "Watch your mouth, Hiram," John said. His voice was a low growl. "Oh, come now," Hiram smirked, tapping his cane against his polished boot. "A woman like this, no kin, no name, found on the trail. We all know the type. They're useful for a season, aren't they? Until the novelty wears off." I felt the old shame rising. The cold realization that to men like Hiram, I wasn't a person. I was a utility, a shadow. John stepped forward. He stood between me and Hiram, blocking the man's view of me. He claimed the space. He claimed the moment. "You listen to me, and you listen good," John said. Every word was a hammer blow. "She is not a drifter for you to judge, and she is not a stray for you to insult. Abigail Mercer stands under my roof and under my protection. She has earned her place here with her labor and her character. 2 things you wouldn't recognize if they bit you. In this house, every person has a right to sanctuary. That isn't a charity I'm giving her. It's an acknowledgement of her inherent worth as a human soul. She has a right to be here, and she has a right to be respected just as much as any man with a title or a deed. If you cannot understand that, then you aren't fit to stand on this porch." Hiram blinked. His smirk faltered. He wasn't used to men talking about rights for women like me. "I'm here to talk business, Sterling," Hiram muttered, trying to regain his footing. "Business is over," John said. "Get off my land and don't come back until you've learned how to speak to a lady." Hiram retreated to his carriage. The dust he kicked up was as dark as his heart. When the carriage was gone, John turned to me. He looked uncomfortable. He wasn't a man used to making speeches. "I'm sorry you had to hear that, Abigail," he said. "I've heard worse," I replied. My voice was a bit thick. I looked at the limestone walls of the house. They looked stronger than they had 10 minutes ago. "John," I said. "Yeah?" "Thank you for saying it, not just for me, but for saying it out loud. Most people think those things, but they're too afraid to name them. They think if they don't say it, it isn't real." John nodded slowly. "Some things need to be named, Abigail, or they get lost in the wind." I went back inside to the kitchen. The oven was hot. The bread was rising. For the first time in 32 years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the wagon to leave without me. I was home, even if it was only for a week. Millhaven was a town of 400 people and 4,000 judgments. It sat on the edge of the prairie, a collection of false-fronted buildings and hitching posts. It smelled of coal smoke, manure, and gossip. We went there on a Tuesday, John, Sam, and me, to get supplies. Martha needed flour, and John needed salt for the cattle. I wore my best dress. It was a simple calico, patched at the elbows, but clean. I'd brushed my hair until it shone. I wanted to feel like I belonged. But the moment we stepped off the wagon, the air changed. People didn't stop talking. They just changed the volume. They whispered behind their hands. They peeked through the lace curtains of the tea room. The gossip had traveled faster than we had. The widow from the trail. The woman in the Sterling house. In the center of it all was Beatrice Vance. She was the mayor's wife. She was the self-appointed gatekeeper of Millhaven's morality. She wore silk and lace even in the dust of Kansas, and she carried her religion like a switch. We encountered her in the general store. She was standing by the bolt of blue silk surrounded by two other women who looked like they lived on a diet of vinegar and sour grapes. John was at the back, talking to the clerk about seed. Sam was looking at the jars of peppermint sticks. I was checking the price of coffee. Beatrice Vance turned her head. She didn't look at me. She looked at the air around me, as if it were contaminated. "It is a tragedy," Beatrice said, her voice carrying across the store like a bell. "A tragedy when a man of standing loses his way. To bring a woman of unknown origins shut into a house with a motherless child, it's a scandal against decency." One of the other women nodded. "I heard she came from a house of labor in Wichita, or worse. You can see it in the eyes, that hardened look." I felt the blood drain from my face. I wasn't hardened. I was tired. There is a difference. John heard her. He started to move forward, his jaw set. But I put a hand on his arm. I didn't want him to fight this one for me, not this time. I walked toward Beatrice Vance. I didn't run. I walked with the steady pace of a woman who had walked 1,000 miles and wasn't afraid of one more. "Mrs. Vance," I said. She stiffened. She looked at me then, her eyes narrow and cold. "I have nothing to say to you, young woman. But I have something to say to you," I replied. I looked at the women around her. I looked at the clerk. I looked at Sam, who was watching me with those wide, dark eyes. "You talk about decency as if it were something you bought by the yard, like that silk," I said. My voice was calm, rhythmic, like the trail itself. "But my history as an orphan and a widow does not define my morality. You judge me because I have no husband to speak for me and no father to name me. But a woman's virtue is measured by the kindness in her hands and the truth in her words, not by the vanity of her lineage. You think you are protecting this town, but you are only protecting your own fear of anything that doesn't look like you. Being found on a trail doesn't make a woman lost in the way you mean. It just means she survived. And survival is a more honest virtue than sitting in a parlor gossiping about people you don't know." Beatrice's face went a strange shade of purple. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "How dare you?" she hissed. "You are a nobody, a stray." "I am Abigail Mercer," I said. "And I know who I am. That's more than you can say, Beatrice. You're just a collection of other people's opinions." I turned away. I went back to the coffee. John was standing by the counter. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't pity. It wasn't even pride. It was recognition. We finished our shopping in silence. As we walked out to the wagon, Hiram Thaddeus was standing by the hitching post. He'd seen the whole thing through the window. He was smiling. It wasn't a nice smile. "Bold words, Mrs. Mercer," Hiram said, leaning against a post. "But bold words don't change the law or the past." He looked at John. "Sterling, a word." John stepped aside. I stayed by the wagon with Sam. I could see them talking. Hiram was gesturing toward me. He looked smug. He was holding a piece of paper. A telegram, maybe. When John came back, his face was pale. He didn't look at me. He just climbed onto the wagon seat and snapped the reins. "John?" I asked as we rolled out of town. "What is it?" "Nothing," he said. "It wasn't nothing. Hiram Thaddeus doesn't smile for nothing." John didn't answer for a long time. The only sound was the creak of the wheels and the distant call of a meadowlark. "He thinks he's found something," John finally said. "He's been digging into the asylum in Ohio, into the war records. He says you're hiding something, Abigail. He says you aren't who you say you are." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The past was like a wolf. You could run from it, but it always knew your scent. "I haven't lied to you, John," I said. "I know," he said. He looked at the road ahead. "But Hiram doesn't care about the truth. He cares about leverage. He thinks if he can ruin your name, he can force me to sell. He thinks I won't stand by a scandalous woman." He looked at me then, truly looked at me. "He's wrong," John said. But as the sun set over the Flint Hills, I knew the battle was just beginning. Millhaven was a small town, and small towns have a way of crushing anything they don't understand. I looked at Sam. He reached out and touched my hand. It was a small gesture, a tiny anchor. "I'm still here, Sam," I whispered. "I know," he said. We rode into the dark, the limestone house waiting for us like a fortress. But even fortresses have cracks. And I knew Hiram Thaddeus was the kind of man who knew exactly where to drive the wedge. The wind changed on the Thursday. It came down from the north, sharp and smelling of distant snow. The limestone walls of the Sterling house usually kept the cold at bay, but this was a creeping chill. It was the kind of cold that found the cracks in your spirit. I was in the kitchen stoking the embers of the wood stove when I heard the sound. A soft, wet cough. It was coming from Sam's room. I didn't wait for permission. I grabbed a candle and moved through the quiet hall. The house was a tomb at 3 o'clock in the morning. Sam was tangled in his blankets. His face was flushed, the color of a sunset that promised a storm. His skin was dry, too dry. When I touched his forehead, the heat startled me. It wasn't just a chill, it was a fire. "Sam," I whispered. He didn't wake. He just let out a low, whimpering sound. It broke my heart. It was the sound of a child who didn't expect anyone to come. I went to work. I fetched cool water from the pump. I found the willow bark Martha kept in the pantry for aches. I sat on the edge of his bed and began to bathe his face, my movements slow and rhythmic. A shadow fell across the doorway. It was John. He was half-dressed, his hair mussed, his eyes full of a sudden sharp fear. He looked at Sam, then at me. He looked helpless. "What is it?" he asked. His voice was a rasp. "Fever," I said. "A bad one, but he's breathing. Help me lift him a bit. We need to get some of this tea into him." For the next 4 hours, we were a team. We didn't talk much. We moved in the space between the coughs. John held Sam's head. I pressed the cool cloth to his chest. We watched the candle burn down to a nub of wax. Around dawn, Sam's breathing leveled out. The sweat finally broke. He turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were clear for the first time in a long time. "Abby," he whispered. "I'm here, Sam. I'm right here." He reached out a small, hot hand and gripped my sleeve. Then he closed his eyes and fell into a deep, honest sleep. John stood up. He walked to the window and watched the gray light bleed into the sky. He looked older. He looked like a man who had been carrying a mountain on his back. "I thought I was going to lose him," John said. He didn't turn around. Like I lost Sarah. I thought, I'm not good at this, Abigail. I'm good at fixing fences. I'm good at luing cattle. But I don't know how to do this. I stood up and walked to him. I didn't touch him. I just stood in his space. You think providing is the same as protecting, John, I said. He turned to look at me. Isn't it? No, I said. I wanted the words to land. I wanted him to hear the truth of it. A sturdy house doesn't make a home, John. And healing a child's heart isn't about how much food you provide for their survival. It's about having the courage to be present in their darkest nights. You've been providing for Sam, but you've been hiding from his grief because it reminds you of your own. But a father's job isn't to be a silent statue. It's to be the hand that holds the light when the world goes dark. You don't have to have the answers. You just have to be in the room. John looked at the floor. He let out a long, shaky breath. I've been so afraid of saying the wrong thing, he whispered, that I didn't say anything at all. Silence is a language too, I said. And to a child, it sounds like abandonment. But you stayed tonight. He felt that. That's where the healing starts. John looked back at the bed. He looked at his son's hand still resting near where I had been sitting. Thank you, Abigail, he said. Don't thank me, I replied. Just stay in the room. I went back to the kitchen to start the coffee. The sun was up now. The world was still cold, but the light was coming back. The peace lasted exactly 3 days. It ended when John came back from Millhaven with a telegram in his hand. I was in the yard, hanging the wash. The wind was whipping the sheets, making a sound like sails in a gale. I knew something was wrong the moment I saw his horse. He wasn't riding. He was pushing. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost and was trying to outrun it. He stopped in front of me. He didn't get down, he just looked at me. His eyes were full of a strange, wounded suspicion. It was a look I'd seen 1,000 times in the eyes of men who had been told a lie and wanted to believe it. John? I asked. My heart was a stone in my chest. He held out the paper. His hand was shaking just a fraction. Hiram Thaddeus got a reply from Ohio, John said, from the asylum, and from the county clerk in Fort Dodge. I didn't take the paper. I didn't need to. I knew what Hiram would have asked, and I knew what the records would say. They would say I was a ward of the state. They would say I had no known kin. They would mention the unfortunate circumstances of my husband's death. They would paint a picture of a woman with no roots and no reason to be trusted. And? I asked. I kept my voice flat. I kept my head high. He says you aren't a widow, John said. He says the war records don't show a marriage for an Abigail Mercer. He says you're a drifter who stole a name to get a place on that wagon train. He says you're a fraud, Abigail. I looked at him. I looked at the man I had sat with through the fever, the man I had started to trust. And you believe him? I asked. I don't know what to believe, John shouted. He finally jumped down from the horse. I have a son to think about. I have a name in this valley. If you lied about who you are, how can I trust anything you've done? I felt a coldness settle over me. It wasn't anger. It was weariness. It was the exhaustion of a woman who had been proving her worth every day for 32 years, only to have it wiped away by a piece of paper. I told you I was an orphan, I said. I told you I was a widow. The state of Ohio doesn't keep good records for people like me, John. We don't have family Bibles. We don't have land deeds. Our lives are written in sweat, not in ink. If that isn't enough for you, then I'm already gone. Abigail, wait. No, I said. I turned away. I'm tired of being an extra weight, John. I'm tired of being a stray that needs to be justified. I'll be gone by morning. I walked into the house. I didn't cry. I went to the wagon partition and started packing my small bundle. My hands were steady. They had practice. I didn't see Sam standing in the corner. I didn't see him slip out the back door. It was an hour later when Martha came into the kitchen, her face pale. He's gone, she whispered. Sam's gone. His pony is in the stall, but the boy is nowhere to be found. The world seemed to tilt. John came running in from the barn. The anger was gone now, replaced by a raw, naked panic. "Sam!" he yelled, running into the yard. "Samuel!" We searched the house. We searched the barn. We searched the creek. The sun was dipping low and the Kansas wind was picking up again. In the Flint Hills, when the sun goes down, the temperature drops like a stone. A boy alone in the tall grass wouldn't last the night. "Think, Abigail," John pleaded. He was shaking now. He looked at me with a desperate, broken hope. "Where would he go? You know him better than anyone." I closed my eyes. I pictured Sam. I pictured the way he looked when he was thinking. I pictured the day we fixed the Pinto Colt. "The thinking spot," I said. "The limestone ledge behind the North Ridge." He said, "The wind sounds like singing there." We rode hard. We pushed the horses up the steep, rocky slope. My heart was praying with every hoofbeat. We found him. He was huddled under the limestone overhang, his knees pulled up to his chin. He looked small. He looked like a speck of dust in the vastness. John was off his horse before it had even stopped. He ran to the boy and pulled him into his arms. He held him so tight I thought Sam might break. "Why?" John choked out. "Why would you run, Sam?" Sam looked up. He looked at his father, then he looked at me. A single tear tracked through the dust on his cheek. "I didn't want to be in a house where people don't stay," Sam said. His voice was small, but it cut through the wind like a knife. John froze. He looked at the boy. Then he looked at me, standing by the horses. He saw the bundle tied to my saddle. He saw the truth of what he had almost done. John stood up. He didn't let go of Sam's hand. He walked toward me, his boots crunching on the limestone. "Abigail," he said. I didn't answer. I just watched him. John took a deep breath. He looked at the vast amber hills. Then he looked me right in the eye. "I have spent my whole life thinking that being a man meant being right," John said. His voice was steady now. "I judged you based on the whispers of a world that fears independent women, because I was afraid of being wrong again. But I was a coward, Abigail. I listened to a piece of paper instead of listening to my own heart. I listened to a liar instead of looking at the woman who saved my son. I was wrong. And I'm sorry." He stepped closer. "Long tin, kom feila tu emphachung min temnua, Abigail. Trust isn't earned through a record or a deed. It's earned through the way a person stands when the wind blows. You've stood for us, and I'm asking you to stay. Not because we need a cook, but because I was wrong to ever let you think you were anything less than my equal." I looked at him. I looked at Sam, who was watching us with a quiet intensity. The wind was still blowing. The trail was still out there, long and dusty and full of ghosts. But for the first time in 32 years, I didn't feel like I had to run. "The wagon partition is still there, John," I said. "We can burn it," he replied. I stayed, not because I was claimed, but because for the first time, I had found a man who was brave enough to admit he was lost. We rode back to the ranch in the twilight. The limestone house was waiting for us. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a beginning. The air in Millhaven didn't smell like the prairie. It smelled like damp wool and judgment. I didn't ask John to come with me. I didn't want a protector. I wanted to be a person who stood on her own 2 feet. If I was going to stay in this valley, I had to face the wind, alone. I walked into the basement of the Methodist church. It was Tuesday, the ladies' social. The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that has teeth. Beatrice Vance sat at the head of a long table, a teacup held halfway to her mouth. She looked like a queen who had just spotted a peasant in the counting room. "Mrs. Mercer," Beatrice said. Her voice was a thin blade. "I believe you've mistaken the day. This is a gathering for the ladies of the congregation." I didn't sit. I stood at the end of the table. I kept my back straight. I kept my hands folded. "I didn't mistake the day, Beatrice," I said. "I came because I heard you were talking about me. And I figure if you're going to spend your breath on my life, you ought to hear the truth of it from the source." One of the younger women looked down at her knitting. The others just stared. "I am an orphan," I said. My voice was steady. rhythmic. I grew up in an asylum where I was a number before I was a name. I lost a husband to a war that didn't care about our small farm. I lost a child on a trail that was too hard for a tiny spirit. Those aren't crimes. They're scars. I looked at Beatrice. I didn't blink. I want you to listen to me, ladies, because this is something your Sunday sermons seem to miss, I said. I wanted the words to stick. If your faith teaches you to cast out the orphan and trample the widow because her past isn't as tidy as yours, then it is not faith, it is cowardice. A true community is built by lifting broken souls, not by stepping on them to feel closer to God. Kindness isn't a reward for being lucky enough to have a family name. It's a responsibility we owe to every human being who is trying to survive the night. When you gossip about a woman's virtue without knowing her heart, you aren't protecting your town. You are just poisoning the well we all have to drink from. The room stayed quiet, but it wasn't the quiet with teeth anymore. It was the quiet of people who had been caught looking at something ugly in the mirror. Willa Crane, a woman who had lost 3 sons to the fever and rarely spoke, stood up. She walked to the end of the table. She put a hand on my arm. I believe the girl is right, Willa said. Her voice was soft, but it carried. We've been acting like the Pharisees. Sit down, Abigail. Have some tea. I didn't stay for tea. I'd said what I needed to say. I walked out of the church and straight to the office of Hiram Thaddeus. He was behind his desk looking at a map. He looked up and smiled that oily smile. He thought he'd won. He thought the telegram from Ohio had ended me. Mrs. Mercer, he said. Come to sign a confession? I walked to his desk. I pulled a folded piece of paper from my pocket. It wasn't the telegram. It was a page from the Kansas City Star, dated 2 months ago. I spend a lot of time in offices, Hiram, I said, usually cleaning them. And when you clean, you read. You read the things people throw away. I laid the paper on his desk. It was a notice from the Railroad Commission. The Union Pacific isn't coming through the eastern Flint Hills, I said. The Geological Survey found the limestone too unstable. They're diverting south through the valley. You knew that, didn't you? Hiram's smile vanished. He looked at the paper. He looked at me. You've been trying to scare John into selling for pennies because you want to flip the land to the cattle syndicate, not the railroad, I said. I think you should know, Hiram, that truth isn't something you can bury just because you have a better suit. You think you're smart because you can manipulate a ledger. But I grew up in a world where the only thing I had was my word. And a person who lies to destroy someone's life isn't a businessman. He's just a thief who's too afraid to use a gun. I've already sent a copy of this to the sheriff. Hiram didn't say a word. He looked like a man who had been bitten by a dog he thought was a rug. I walked out. The Kansas sun was bright. The air was clear. I felt lighter than I had in 32 years. I wasn't baggage. I wasn't a stray. I was a woman who knew the truth. And in the West, that was the only currency that never lost its value. The first snow came in November. It was a quiet snow. It didn't howl. It just drifted down like white ash, coating the limestone house and turning the Flint Hills into a world of lace. The house felt smaller in the winter, closer. The smell of cedar wood and roasting coffee filled every corner. Sam spent his days by the hearth, reading to Martha. Martha's back was better, but she'd grown fond of having a boy to boss around. Abigail, Martha said one morning. She was kneading dough, her hands moving with the strength of a woman half her age. Yes, Martha. I thought you'd be gone by now, she said. She didn't look at me. Most women found on a trail, they have itchy feet. They're looking for a destination. They don't know how to just be. I stopped polishing the silver. I looked at her. I was looking for a destination, Martha, I said. I just didn't realize it was a person, not a place. Martha nodded. She took a breath and looked me in the eye. I want you to know something, Martha said. A home isn't a location on a map. It's a decision to stay when the wind gets cold. I've seen a lot of people come and go through this valley. They think a better life is just over the next ridge, but a better life is right where you're standing, if you're brave enough to build it. You're building something here, Abigail. Don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong to the foundation. I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. Thank you, Martha. That evening, Sam was in bed. The house was quiet. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the ticking of the clock. John sat at the table. He was holding a small, yellowed envelope. He looked at it for a long time before he spoke. Abigail, he said. I sat down across from him. Yes, John? He pushed the envelope toward me. This was Sarah's, my wife. She wrote it when she was sick. It was in her Bible. I didn't read it for 5 years. I was too much of a coward. I looked at the envelope. For John. Read it, he whispered. I opened it. The handwriting was elegant but shaky. John, it read, I am not afraid of the dark. I am only afraid that you will let the dark become your skin. You have a way of leaving, John, not with your boots, but with your heart. You hide when things hurt. But Samuel needs a father who stays. He needs to see that love is a choice you make every morning, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. I folded the paper. I looked at John. His eyes were wet. She knew me, John said. She knew I'd try to hide. And I did. I hid until you came along. He reached across the table. He took my hand. His skin was rough, calloused from a life of work, but his grip was gentle. The town, they still talk, John said. They say I claimed you, like I found a stray horse and put my brand on it. It's a term they use because they don't understand anything else. He squeezed my hand. But I want to declare something to you, Abigail, John said. His voice was thick with an honest, raw emotion. I am not claiming you as my property or my charity. I am claiming you as my equal. Tin U, Abigail, isn't about one person saving another. It's about two people standing together against the wind. You don't belong to me. You belong with me. That's a difference that most people in this world never learn. They think love is a transaction, but it's a partnership. It's a promise that I will see your worth even on the days you can't see it yourself. You aren't a guest in this house anymore. You are the heartbeat of it. I couldn't speak for a moment. The orphan girl inside me was crying. Not because she was sad, but because she was finally being heard. I'm staying, John, I said. My voice was a whisper. I'm staying as long as the limestone stands. Then we're all right, he said. We sat there in the quiet. The snow continued to fall outside, burying the trail, burying the past, burying all the times I had been left behind. The trail was gone. There was only the house, the fire, and the man who had finally learned how to stay in the room. I looked at the window. The reflection of the fire looked like a star caught in the glass. I wasn't alone on the trail anymore. I was exactly where I was meant to be. Spring didn't just come to the Flint Hills. It exploded. The amber waves of the winter grass gave way to a green so bright it made your eyes ache. The air smelled of damp earth and blooming bluestem. The Smoky Hill River was running high, fat with the melt from the north. It sounded like a long, steady applause. It was April 1879. Exactly 6 months since a wagon master named Amos Thatcher left me in the red dust with $1.40. We didn't go to the church in Mill Haven for the wedding. We didn't need a steeple to tell God we were serious. We held it right there at the Sterling Ranch on the limestone porch that had become my sanctuary. The house was the witness. The land was the altar. Willa Crane was there. She'd driven out from town with a basket of early wildflowers and a heart full of grit. She stood in my small room in the additive helping me with my hair. I wasn't wearing white. I didn't have the coin for it, and it didn't feel right for a woman who had walked the miles I'd walked. I wore my best blue calico. Willa had sewn a strip of white lace around the collar, the only bit of fancy I allowed. You look like a woman who knows where she's going, Abigail, Willa said. She was pinning a sprig of verbena into my bun. I do, Willa, I said. For the first time in 32 years, I'm not looking over my shoulder to see if the trail is closing behind me." Willa stopped her hands. She looked at me in the mirror. Her face was a map of her own losses, but her eyes were clear. "I want you to remember something today," Willa said. Her voice was a soft, rhythmic hum. "A wedding isn't a finish line, Abigail. It's a starting gate. And a woman's dignity isn't something a man gives her at the altar like a ring. You brought your dignity with you when you stepped off that wagon. John isn't making you respectable. He's just the first man brave enough to admit you always were. Don't ever let the world tell you that your value started the day a man put his name next to yours." I took a breath. I felt the weight of her words. "I won't, Willa. I promise." We walked out onto the porch. The sun was warm on my skin. The ranch hands were gathered in the yard, their hats off, their faces scrubbed clean. Even Caleb was there, looking uncomfortable but quiet. Martha stood by the door, dabbing at her eyes with her apron and pretending it was just the wind. John was waiting. He wore a dark coat and a clean white shirt. He looked like the limestone itself, steady, unmoving, and permanent. Beside him stood Sam. The boy was wearing a small vest I'd cut down from one of John's old ones. He held a small wooden box in his hands. He wasn't hiding. He was standing tall. Reverend Aldridge stood between them. He'd come out from town, his Bible held tight. He looked at me, and for the first time there was no doubt in his eyes. There was only respect. John stepped forward as I reached the top of the stairs. He didn't take my hand yet. He just looked at me. "Abigail," he whispered. "John," I replied. The Reverend began the service. The words were the old ones, the duly beloveds, and the holy matrimonies. But the air between John and me was filled with things that hadn't been written in any book. When it came time for the vows, John didn't wait for the Reverend to prompt him. He looked at the men in the yard, then he looked at me. He wanted his words to be a matter of record. "I have spent 42 years thinking that a man's worth was measured by the size of his herd and the strength of his fences," John said. His voice was a low, steady chime. "But Abigail taught me that a man doesn't just promise his name when he takes a wife. He promises his presence. I am not claiming this woman today to be a servant to my house or a shadow to my life. I am pledging to be her partner. I am pledging that in this house, equality isn't a luxury, it's the law. I am promising to stay in the room, even when the dark comes. Because a true home is built on the truth. And the truth is that I'm a better man because she chose to stay." My heart felt like it was going to burst the seams of my blue dress. When it was my turn, I didn't look at the crowd. I only looked at John. "I spent my life believing I was baggage," I said. My voice was rhythmic, like the beat of a horse's gallop. "I thought I was something to be discarded when the axle snapped. But I have learned that the trail didn't break me. It pruned me. It took away everything that wasn't real until only the truth was left. And the truth is that I am not here because I was lost. I am here because I found a man who understands that love isn't a rescue. It's a choice. I choose you, John, not because I need a roof, but because I want to build a world with you where no one is ever left behind." Sam stepped forward then. He opened the box. 2 plain gold bands sat on a bed of velvet. We slipped them on. They felt heavy. They felt like anchors. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Reverend said. John leaned in. It wasn't a long kiss. It was a seal. It was a quiet amen to everything we'd said. The yard erupted. The men cheered. Someone started playing a fiddle. Martha started hauling out the pies. I sat on the porch steps. Sam sitting right beside me. He leaned his head against my shoulder. "Ma," he whispered. The word hit me like a physical blow. I'd lost a child on a trail once. I'd carried that empty space in my heart for years, a cold, hollow ache that never went away. "Yes, Sam. I'm glad you're the one who stayed," he said. I pulled him close. I didn't cry. I just held him. I'm glad too, Sam. I'm glad too. Epilogue, 3 years later. Autumn had come again to the Flint Hills, September 1881. I stood on the porch of the small limestone building John had built for me near the main house. It was my clinic. Above the door, a wooden sign swung in the breeze, a J. Sterling, Animal Healing and Rescue. I had 5 horses in the stalls. One was a mare with a torn ligament. Another was a mule that had been beaten by a drifter until John and the sheriff intervened. They came to me now, the ranchers, the farmers, even the people from Millhaven. They didn't call me the stray anymore. They called me when they needed someone who knew how to listen to the things that couldn't speak. I walked down to the Smoky Hill River. The water was low now, whispering over the stones. The red dust was still there, coating the banks. I looked at my hands. They were still calloused. They were still the hands of a worker. But I wore a gold band on my finger, and my belly was heavy with the child that would be born in the spring. John was coming down from the ridge. He was riding the Pinto colt, now a strong, steady stallion. Sam was riding beside him, a confident young man of 11. They looked like they belonged to the land. John hopped off his horse and walked to me. He didn't say a word. He just put his hand on my shoulder. We stood there, looking at the trail, the long, dusty ribbon that stretched out toward the horizon. "Thinking about that day?" John asked. "Always," I said. I looked at the river. I looked at the house. I looked at the man beside me. "I used to think that day was the end of my life," I said. I wanted the lesson to be clear, even to the wind. I thought being left alone on the trail was the ultimate cruelty. But I was wrong. Being left behind was the greatest gift I was ever given. It forced me to stop looking for a wagon to carry me and start walking on my own feet. It taught me that hope isn't a feeling you wait for. It's a fire you build with your own hands. You can be an orphan, a widow, or a ghost. But as long as you refuse to abandon yourself, you are never truly lost. John nodded. He looked at Sam, who was practicing his roping nearby. "The trail is still there, Abigail," John said. "It hasn't changed." "No," I replied, leaning into him. "But I have. And that's the only thing that ever matters." The sun began to set, casting long purple shadows over the Flint Hills. The wind picked up, singing its quiet, rhythmic song. I wasn't an orphan girl found. I was a woman who had finally claimed herself. And in the vast, wild heart of the West, that was the only hope worth having. This channel tells emotional Western cowboy stories about frontier love, family bonds, motherly tenderness, compassion, mercy, and the beauty of human kindness in a harsh land. The value of this story is that we are never truly lost as long as we refuse to abandon ourselves. If this tale gave you even a spark of hope, please like, comment, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to walk with us through more unforgettable stories of the West. This work of fiction is a product of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events, or locales is purely coincidental. The narrative is intended solely for artistic and entertainment purposes and should not be interpreted as a reflection of real individuals or factual occurrences.
Abigail Mercer's story leaves us with a truth as wide and enduring as the western prairie. A person's worth is never decided by the cruelty of others. She began her journey as a woman left behind in the dust, dismissed as useless because she had no husband, no family name, and no powerful voice to defend her. But the trail that abandoned her also revealed her strength. Through hardship, Abigail discovered that dignity is not something the world gives us when it approves of us. Dignity is something we carry within ourselves, even when no one else sees it. This story reminds us that being unwanted by the wrong people can sometimes lead us toward the right place. Abigail was rejected by a wagon train, judged by a town, and nearly broken by whispers from the past. Yet she never allowed shame to become her identity. She kept working, kept loving, kept listening. and kept standing tall. In doing so, she changed not only her own life, but also the lives of John and Sam. She taught a grieving father that love is not merely providing shelter, food, or protection. True love is presence. It is staying in the room when someone is hurting. It is listening when words are too heavy to speak. It is choosing kindness when fear would be easier. The deepest meaning of Abigail's journey is that healing does not always come from grand miracles. Sometimes it comes through a warm meal cooked before sunrise, a gentle hand placed on a frightened horse, a quiet word spoken to a lonely child, or the courage to tell the truth when gossip tries to bury it. Abigail's strength was not loud, but it was unbreakable. She proved that compassion is not weakness, and that patience can be more powerful than force. In a world where many people judge by status, reputation, and appearance, Abigail reminds us to look deeper, to see the human soul beneath the dust, scars, and silence. Her story also teaches us that home is not simply a roof over our heads. Home is where we are respected, where we are allowed to be whole, where our past is not used as a weapon against us. Abigail did not find happiness because a man rescued her. She found it because she refused to abandon herself, and when she finally chose to stay, it was not from need, but from love, trust, and equality. That is what makes her journey so powerful. So, as this story comes to an end, let us remember this. No matter how many times life leaves us standing alone on a lonely trail, we are not finished. We may be wounded, tired, or forgotten by others, but as long as we still choose hope, we can begin again. Abigail Mercer was once called baggage, a stray, and a woman with no place to belong. But in the end, she became the heart of a home, the healer of broken spirits, and a woman who finally claimed herself. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. The world may leave you behind, but you must never leave yourself behind.